Recently, Totally Not Mark let out a fantastic video called The Day That Dragon Ball Died, and in it he talks a lot about how somewhere along the line the fights and general choreography lost the narrative through line that was so core to what Dragon Ball was. And now there's this idea that the series focuses on fights for fighting's sake, and you kinda have to dredge through those fights in order to reach the actual plot. Check it out if you haven't, I'll leave it linked in the description, but it got me thinking about what I wanted from a good sequel for Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z and what that might look like. And interestingly enough, that actually brought me to Dragon Ball GT of all things. Now, if there's one anime that people universally hate with not many defenders, it's probably Dragon Ball GT. This was the 1996 sequel to one of the most iconic and important series to ever exist in anime, but despite the overwhelming hate this series received, there's still a moment that I wanted to talk about which to me inherited the heart and will of what Dragon Ball was better than Dragon Ball Z ever did. And I know that this is a pretty bold claim. Dragon Ball Z was a show that inspired a generation and opened the floodgates of anime to the West, with its most prominent impact being found in what came next, leaving an imprint on Shonen Jump that cascaded through the series that would follow in its footsteps. With the greatest inheritors of Dragon Ball's legacy being One Piece, Naruto, and Bleach, which earned the title of the Big Three as they were the shows that would fill in the vacuum that was left behind by the ending of Dragon Ball Z. And what you might notice about the Big Three is that it does not include Dragon Ball GT, the direct sequel to the series itself. And getting ahead of the people in the comments, yes, GT is a sequel, no, it is not canon, and no, it doesn't particularly matter for this video. But just quickly, rather than having Akira Toriyama write it like the original and Dragon Ball Z, it was instead written by Aya Matsui and Atsushi Maekawa. And to say that Toriyama's absence was tangible is an understatement. The core premise of GT is that 10 years after the end of Z, the Pilaf gang uses the Black Star Dragon Balls to turn Goku back into a child, not knowing that the Black Star Balls would cause the planet that they were used on to explode if they weren't gathered back within a year. So, together with his granddaughter Pan and Trunks, Goku needs to travel through the galaxy visiting different planets and gathering these 7 Black Star Dragon Balls as shenanigans ensue. While the opening arcs are famously terrible, the series does have some shining moments that even the biggest haters often have a soft spot for. Things like Baby, Super Saiyan 4, and the Shadow Dragons all stand out as these great moments in the series that have this really cool feeling of nostalgia for any Dragon Ball fan. And that's even despite GT being, well, GT. But these aren't the moments that I think make a good sequel for the original Dragon Ball. Instead, we're going to take a look at Dragon Ball GT, A Hero's Legacy. To fully appreciate this though, we first have to step back all the way to the mid-80s, where it all began with the original Dragon Ball. Long before the planet-bursting energy beams and the series of never-ending transformations, Goku was just a young boy living with his adopted grandfather Gohan. Things pretty quickly change for Goku though, as one night he walks out and sees the full moon, turns into a giant ape, and accidentally kills Gohan as he's on a rampage. He later comes into contact with Bulma, and decides to join her on her quest to find the 7 Dragon Balls. Now, what's beautiful about the original series is that it's very down-to-earth. Yes, there's giant monkeys, flying nimbuses, a wish-granting dragon, and those aren't exactly normal things. But the series is heavily inspired by Journey to the West and Japanese yokai, so things like talking animals, demons, and gods were pretty in line with the charm that Dragon Ball had to offer. And at the end of the day, Dragon Ball was just a martial arts adventure series, and all those flashy elements were there to build on top of that rather than be the focus of it. As Mark discussed in his video, there was this idea that if there was going to be fighting, it tended to have a narrative importance to it, developing characters, showing how far they've grown, and it wasn't just for the sake of fighting. In Dragon Ball, there were a few fights that did stand out as particularly special to me, and largely I think that's because of how personal they often were, with the most impactful to me always being Goku's fight against his resurrected grandfather. There's this level of heartfeltness that we don't really get to see too often in the series after Dragon Ball ended. Not to say that it never reaches those points again, but as a whole, there's a clear step away from this sort of thing. And in particular, I think that this fight is a great representation of one of the most powerful core motifs that Dragon Ball has in general, that being the passing of the torch to the next generation. When Goku fights Grandpa Gohan, Gohan is wearing a mask to conceal his identity, and he's doing this in hopes that he can truly test Goku and gauge how far he's come, seeing his biggest strengths shine and helping him to recognize his greatest weaknesses. It's something so core to the series that it doesn't just happen this once, but it's also an exact plot point that gets used again with Roshi and his persona of Jackie Chun, which is done for effectively the same reason. As Goku develops and becomes more competent as a fighter, Roshi eventually tells him that he has nothing left to offer and has him go out in search of new types of training, leading him to people like Korin and Kami, and all those others who helped him develop his abilities. These are the previous Guardians of Earth who are readying the next generation, and this is something picked up almost immediately in the series, continuing all the way until the very last conversation of the original Dragon Ball manga, where Kami asks Goku to take his place as God and Earth's protector. And while Goku turns down the title of God, we do kinda see him fulfilling this role of Earth's protector, stopping the invasion of the Saiyans, stopping Frieza, stopping Buu. While he might not actually take the title, it doesn't really change the fact that he fills that position. As Z starts to develop, we definitely start to shift away from martial arts, and the whole down-to-earth aspect that the original series had can become a little bit muddled, for better or for worse. But we do continue to see the idea of raising the next generation taking shape, particularly through the character of Gohan. We watch Gohan from this crybaby kid with great potential at the start of the series grow into someone who is trained by Piccolo, goes on his own adventures to Namek to search for the Dragon Balls. And while Gohan isn't the character who usually wins the big fights for the majority of the early series, there is still an undeniable focus on him as he grows through the adventure because his dad is dead for like half of it. And this ultimately leads us to the Cell Saga, where Gohan finally takes center stage and reaches a moment of self-realization, becoming a fully developed character that understands that pure pacifism is just as flawed as pure violence. As the fight reaches its peak, Goku needs to sacrifice himself to protect Gohan and everyone else, but when Cell returns, Gohan is shaken and unsure that he's able to fill his father's shoes. So Goku's spirit returns for a moment to bolster his son's final Kamehameha, and together they finally kill Cell, giving Gohan the final push that he needs to know that he can actually do it. And this is a beautiful ending for the series, except it's not the end. The Buu arc is famous for having mixed reviews, iconic elements like Super Saiyan 3, Ultimate Gohan, Fusion, and Majin Buu himself, but it starts with something very different. A part of Dragon Ball that I personally really love, where we follow Gohan in his life after the Cell Saga. We see him adjusting to a more or less normal life, even if he does dress up like a superhero sometimes. But there's definitely a notable shift in the series as a whole. And people always complain about Gohan not being the warrior that he was at the end of the Cell Saga, but that's never what the character wanted. Gohan always wanted to be a scholar, he always hated fighting. Yes, he was great at it, but that doesn't change that that's not what he wanted. The Cell Saga finale was Gohan understanding that even though fighting isn't what he wants, it is sometimes required. And it isn't like just because he won that fight, he suddenly fell in love with battle. I definitely agree that the character does become less interesting after the Cell Saga, but it's an arc that is fitting for Gohan himself, and I really wouldn't change it if I had the choice. The issue is that as the Buu arc continues, that idea of legacy suddenly vanishes. Gohan isn't the one inheriting that will anymore. Even despite getting some new form throughout the saga, he's not the one who will ultimately protect Earth. Instead, we see Goku being brought back into the limelight, and rather than a story where the next generation is growing and developing, suddenly we're just watching the old guard get bigger and stronger. It's just Goku getting new forms, and that's what progresses the story. And I think that that's something that the series itself realized as it got towards the end of Z. They start the final section of the series with Goku training Goten, which, great. Gohan hated fighting, he started a family, and he's moved on. But Goten always kinda liked sparring for the most part, or at least he would have more fun with it than Gohan ever did. But then the World Tournament starts, and in the last few episodes we're suddenly introduced to Oob. And personally, I like the idea of Oob's character, but it still feels really hollow, if that makes sense. The character just kind of shows up out of nowhere. We get this random explanation from Goku where he's like, yeah, that's probably Kid Buu's reincarnation, don't worry about it. And then Goku just decides to leave and train him, literally shocking everyone else in the cast except for Vegeta. And as Goku himself explained, he doesn't really care about training Oob for the protection of Earth. He's instead just looking for one more great battle. So the show dips its toe back into the idea of legacy and passing the torch, only to immediately start backing up, and all with a character who was just introduced moments ago. If this had a more developed build-up, if we had more time and the actual intention was there, I think this could have been really good, but it just ended up feeling so empty for me. Dragon Ball Super just kinda continues this problem as well. We see arcs that just keep getting bigger in scale one after another, to the point where the multiverse is on the line, and characters aren't really learning or developing, they're just getting stronger. Yes, I know Vegeta has an arc in the manga, but like, great, that doesn't really change much here. It's a standout exception to the rule rather than a continuous trend. So instead, I'm looking to Dragon Ball GT. Again, we have this massive issue where they definitely try to bring Trunks and Pan to the forefront of the series, along with the newly young Goku, but they just don't play impactful roles, unfortunately. And in a series where we're faced with the question, what if Goku lost all his strength and had to rely on that new generation? The answer we received was, don't worry, Goku still carries. And we just see all the other leads fall to the wayside. GT has a lot to offer as a series, but it isn't exactly a show where people who aren't Goku get to shine. But hidden in GT is a gem for what the future of Dragon Ball could have been, or at least a perfect open ending for the franchise that's filled with the themes that the original franchise had been built upon. Dragon Ball GT: A Hero's Legacy was a TV special that acted as an epilogue to the franchise. Yet it's one that most people disregard as filler because it's attached to the GT story. 100 years after the defeat of Omega Shenron, and long after Goku has become one with Shenron himself, we pick up with a very old Pan and her grandson Goku Jr. praying over the graves of all the heroes that we knew and loved. This Goku is far from the one we knew. He is anxious, he's clumsy, and has a severe lack of confidence. But just like our Goku, he's training under his grandparent. Early on in A Hero's Legacy, Pan becomes deathly ill, and Goku Jr., remembering his grandma's story about the magical Dragon Balls, sets off on a journey to find them so that he can save her. For this, he must adventure to Mount Paozu, the same place where Goku lived with Grandpa Gohan years and years ago, because he knows that a Dragon Ball is hidden away there. The journey there is classic Dragon Ball. There is comedy, giant demons, magical monsters, and it's just a very simple adventure. While Goku Jr. isn't a confident fighter, just like Gohan, his emotions can take over and he'll temporarily reach his potential. And I'm going to level with you. A Hero's Legacy is far from perfect, but it has this overwhelming feeling of nostalgia for the original Dragon Ball that just oozes off of it. Ultimately, Goku Jr. does reach Mount Paozu, and he finds the 4-star Dragon Ball in Great-Grandpa Gohan's home. And what I really like about coming back to this mountain is that we're ending the story where we began, which is kinda cool. Goku Jr. begins praying to summon Shenron and asks to save his grandmother, but nothing happens. And instead, we see this young boy who set out on a huge journey just break down into tears, asking what he did wrong and why Shenron won't save his grandmother. And then we have it, this beautiful scene, and what I consider to be the perfect ending for Dragon Ball. Our Goku shows up behind him and explains that this isn't how the Dragon Balls work, and he'll need to set out to find all 7 if he wants to make a wish. This moment does so many things. It shows that Goku is still acting as the Guardian of Earth, and he has finally accepted the role that Kami has offered him at the end of the original story. Secondly, it lets us know that even long after our story ends, there's still an adventure that's alive and continuing. And finally, it's a moment of passing the torch. Goku is starting his descendant off on the journey that he went through all those years ago. There's no aliens, no planets are exploding, and there's nothing super crazy. It's just a boy going on an adventure in its simplest form, and that's why I love it. And if you're thinking, but you disliked Oob for being introduced in the last second, how is this any different? I think, to me at least, the series has always focused on Goku and his family, this alien, someone who wasn't even from Earth, becoming its savior because it was the right thing to do, and then starting a family to continue that legacy, which just makes Goku Jr. fit in a little bit more in my mind. Unfortunately, as is tradition, a hero's legacy continues past this perfect ending point. Pan arrives via helicopter to let Goku know that she's okay, and I get why this happens. With no continuation, it's meant to reassure the viewers that Pan doesn't die, but it just takes away so much of what was built up. But for a moment, at least until she arrives, GT had the perfect sequel and finale for Dragon Ball in a way that Dragon Ball Z and Super never did. Thank you guys so much for watching, and until next time, I hope you all stay excellent.